I mean, it's an unusual economic crisis because it's a combination of inflation and probably very stagnant or even negative growth, i.e. we're probably in recession at the same time as having high inflation, which economists call stagflation. And in policy terms, that's a difficult thing to know what to do with, because there are two different routes you'd take on it, really, both of which sort of are a bit counteractive. So I guess the first thing we want to say is that into the middle of that, because we should at this point be thinking about what the structure of our economy is like, into the middle of that we should be injecting the ecological crisis and saying this is a perfect moment to be thinking about how we structure the economy around the ecological crisis in a way which can help people out. And there's a lot of ways in which that can be the case. Those two things can work together. And then so I suppose the primary audience really for this is thinking about that group of progressive economists who at this moment will be thinking, well, how do we deal with an economy which is kind of both, at least if not tanking, it's flatlining, and costs are going up steeply at the same time? How do we think about what to do with that? And what we want to say as Global Action Plan is we don't want to miss the opportunity to bring the ecological crisis into that, and not just climate change as well, but also the nature crisis and the resource use crisis. Because if we continue to ignore these things, particularly at a point when we're thinking about the structure of the economy and how it works around us, then another decade will pass and we will miss the opportunity to get on top of these crises before they become a point which is too critical.
And just thinking about that term progressive, and as you know, I'm new to the environmental sector, but I think I would feel that most people, when they think about a sort of progressive anything, so you progressive economists, progressive public policy, I think inequality is a part of that and justice. But I don't, how much do you think that environmental kind of causes or factors, or climate justice even comes into that? Because I was really struck by in our framing, we are really talking about, when we say benefit both people and planet, we don't just mean living kind of good and healthy lives. We mean actually closing the inequality gap, and really making sure that those who kind of need it most have the support that they require.
It's pretty mainstream in economics to think about the climate crisis, but largely from one perspective, which is, I suppose, the kind of green growth paradigm, is the idea that that by greening the economy we can continue to enjoy the benefits of economic growth. And the reason why that's so important as a concept to progressive economists is that if you want to deliver better prosperity for people at the kind of lower end of the income distribution, i.e. people who have lower incomes at the moment, then you need to create some level of growth so that, I suppose the way in which a lot of progressive economists are currently thinking about the crisis as we face it is that a wage-led recovery would be the best way to achieve a recovery, because that would deal with the fact that people on lower incomes find a cost of living crisis the most difficult to deal with, and also would deal with what will almost certainly happen with this kind of lack of demand in the economy, which will be what sort of precipitates further economic recession if that's what happens. And so, which is, of course, that's where the paradox comes in, because one of the problems with high inflation is you sort of want to reduce, or, this is what Rishi Sunak, for instance, has been saying over the past couple of days, is that he's nervous about tax cuts and putting more money into the economy because that will stimulate more demand and that will push prices up higher potentially. I think a lot of progressive economists are a lot less worried about that, but they are worried about people's standard of living, quite rightly. And they are worried about aggregate demand, about about recession in the economy. And if you combine those two things, then if you boost people's income at this point, then you would have some kind of bulwark against recession. You'd have some kind of increase in aggregate demand, which is kind of which is kind of fine, but I suppose what we're saying at Global Action Plan is demand for what? And that's where this point about structure comes in, because if we're just creating demand for things that are environmentally harmful, even if they're not massively problematic from a climate point of view, then we're not moving forward. We're standing still. And so we might be in the short term, we might be improving people's quality of life and income quality of life and boosting that aggregate demand across the economy. But if we're not thinking about demand for what, then we're not thinking about the right things. And I think that's the bit that's often missing from the progressive debate. I think it's that demand for what that is the key thing.
And I think that comes back to your point about green growth, where I feel like that is often talked about in terms of tech specifically, and possibly even solely, that it's a technology, it's a technological revolution that is then going to fuel green growth, green jobs, and then therefore there's a kind of, there's a skills need that's going to come along with that. But that's not necessarily, I'm struck by, again, I think one of the things we're saying is it's not just technology. Structural change is more than that, and we need to really be thinking more in the round, more holistically about, fundamentally it's about the society that we want and the economy that supports that.
That's right, and also to keeping economics in proportion, because at a point like this, I wouldn't want to be the one that suggested the economy doesn't matter, because to a lot of people, more than just people on low incomes, actually, people on kind of median incomes are going to be facing quite a lot of difficult choices over these next few months. And they're not choices about whether to consume luxury items. They're choices, a lot of those things are already going. We're seeing that already in the economy. They're choices about whether to consume, in the end, in the autumn and sort of early winter, when we start to put on our heating again, there'll be choices about heating and eating. And that won't just be among the lowest income households. That will be quite a large number of households, which is a profound challenge for the government and the economy. So I wouldn't want to trivialise the economy, but we do need to keep it in proportion and think, at least over the kind of medium to long term, what is it we want? What do we want out of the economy? What's its purpose? And I think its purpose is to safeguard the environment and to look after our well-being. And it's not the other way around. So it is the right time to think about it, because we do need to think about the structure of demand at this point, because we're thinking about demand and because we're thinking about stimulating it. So if we're thinking about what kind of things do we want to be clustering around people and communities at the moment to make sure that they've got the wherewithal to cope with the current crisis, certainly boosting wages is inevitable and important, or boosting household income is inevitable and important. A lot of people on the environment side have always been a bit wary of that debate, because if you put more money into people's pockets, they'll spend it. But at the moment, that we need people to, because if you've not got enough money on which to survive and you're making those choices, that's not on in a society where, apart from anything else, there's still large numbers of people who are earning plenty and are plenty well off. So why should it be the case that there is that huge inequity? So that's the kind of inequality side of the debate. But let me give an example, because I think in transport it's a really good example, because the costs of getting around are going up dramatically because the costs of fuel are going up. And of course, that's directly linked to climate change, because that's the cost of oil, essentially, because most of us still get around using oil in one way or another. Even if we use public transport, often most buses are still powered by diesel. So the costs of that are going up dramatically. What do we do about that? Well, there's already a solution that's sort of baked in over the medium term, because the move towards electric vehicles is happening really quickly. And actually, probably in policy terms, there's a few things we need to do and we could make it happen more quickly, but it's going to happen. It's already going to happen. And it's really important that it does, because we need that tech switch. We can't afford, climate-wise, to have fossil fuel vehicles around for, much more than this decade, actually, to be honest. If you could get rid of them all by 2030 and replace many of them with electric vehicles, you would. But then there's a second step to the argument, which is both climate related and also related to costs, and also related to the wider concept of ecological efficiency, because and this is exemplified by the use of increasing number of sports utility vehicles, SUVs. So last year, according to the International Energy Agency, nearly half of all new vehicles sold were SUVs, but more than half of all electric vehicles were SUVs. And it takes 20% more energy to push an SUV through the air on average than an ordinary car. So if we're still wasting, essentially that's wasting energy. So if we're still wasting energy in that way, then there's real opportunity there to save cost, but also to save more energy, because we're moving into the electric era, the era of electricity, when we'll heat our homes and get around using electricity. But it's not limitless. It's going to have limits, and so we're going to have to use it carefully. So the second step is to make everything more efficient. But then the third step, which is really important, really, according to all of the projections, for instance, on climate change, so the Committee on Climate Change says that as well as switching to electric vehicles and making all vehicles more efficient, we're also going to have to use private vehicles less. And actually, I think in London, the GLA, or it's probably Transport for London, estimate that we have to cut journeys by private vehicles to achieve climate targets in London by a quarter. So we're going to also have to bake in alternatives to using private cars and vans. And again, now's the time to do it, because there's already a suggestion that around 1/5 of journeys, or I think it's 1/5 of car mileage was reduced already by 1/5 as a response to the rising price of fuel. So, rather than try and incentivize people to go back into their cars, this seems like the perfect moment to say, well, what we need to do is build in alternatives.
It's a moment of change anyway. It's a moment of
change.
So can you capitalise on it? And it's almost a fork in the road.
Exactly. So, lean into it, because there are many other reasons why we want to get out of private vehicles. From a health point of view, it's much better that we make more journeys. It doesn't mean we don't have cars or we don't have access to cars. It just means that we make more journeys on foot and on bikes, because it's better for us. And also, if we don't deal with congestion in our cities, then there's a huge problem anyway. It doesn't work to have everybody trying to make all their journeys in private vehicles. Plus, electric vehicles are more expensive, and they're not going to get cheaper much. They're not going to become much cheaper very quickly. So I think from a sort of social justice perspective, if you take one step back and say, well, it's about us being mobile, because we have to be mobile to work, to get to our places of work, or to see our families, or for leisure, and we want all of those things to continue to happen, then thinking about this from the perspective of how do we keep people mobile, stay within our planetary boundaries, and also make mobility as affordable as possible to people, and make it healthy, then all of these things we should be doing anyway. And they're really important to do. So that's just one example of how you could lean into the current crisis, and if, sort of from a progressive point of view. Now, overall, what that would do is slightly reduce demand for transport, because although we'd have to go out, and some of us have to go out and buy bikes, for instance, the costs of walking and cycling are very low. So we invest in some infrastructure, which would create some demand, because that would have to be built, and that would create, work and jobs in sort of construction and so on. That's important. But overall, that might reduce demand for transport across the board, or for mobility across the board. It just might, because the more kind of demand, the more kind of economically intensive things in that equation are probably private vehicles and public transport. Mm-hmm. Economically productive, I should say. So that might reduce demand overall. But then our economies include a lot of things, and there's a lot of things in our economies that we need a lot more of, like care and health and housing. Mm-hmm. And so not just thinking about how we move demand around within sectors, but thinking about how we move demand around across the economy is really key. But there's only one way that you can do this, because the market's not going to do this on its own. So some of the market signals are working for the time being. Like, for instance, I imagine at the moment there's a high demand for heat pumps in among households that can afford them. Because at the moment, why would you, if you've got a house that's reasonably well insulated, you can fit a heat pump already. Why would you buy a new gas boiler at this point if you can afford to buy a heat pump? But they're substantially more expensive. I mean, there are some government programs to help, but they're substantially more expensive. So, but we don't want these. Well, we don't want this just to be the preserve of the rich. We want them to be need them to be accessible to everyone, because all households will essentially have to change the way they heat their homes, for instance, change the way they travel. But we also need to think about how we get there, and getting there requires government policy. The market won't do it on its own. It will do some things, and companies taking leadership will do some things. But we do need the state. We do need the government involved, and particularly when you've got kind of overall falling demand, because the government will be looking at ways in which it can boost that demand. And so boosting the right kind of demand is the key.
Yeah, if government are making decisions at this point, again, like we said, it's the fork in the road. It's the chance to make the sort of the right kind of decision. Let's talk a bit more about timing though, because we have. I mean, you've been thinking about this for several months now. We've had the series in the works for a few weeks. But at this particular point, as I sit in my very sweltering house, and kind of keep an eye on the news and Twitter, it does feel extremely timely in a week where, we're facing the UK's first ever red weather warning. After a week of people that want to be Prime Minister, that want to be the chief decision maker in our country, either not talking about climate change or essentially positing net zero in particular as mutually exclusive almost with solving the cost of living crisis. So it does feel particularly timely, which is one of those, I would say, happy coincidences, but it's not, because it's a bit of a grim outlook.
It's pretty grim. Everything's coming together. So you had a cost of living crisis building anyway, because the pandemic has kind of thrown a lot of pebbles into the wheels of the global supply chain. So, that all got very sticky. And that's not unsticking fast, because, for instance, there's parts of China that are still under some restriction. And those countries in East Asia that have tried to be more kind of COVID negative than we perhaps have in Europe are only sort of now emerging, and that's caused a lot of problems, but it's also exposed the fragility of those supply chains. So that's kind of the first factor. And then on top of that, Putin's horrific, brutal invasion of Ukraine, which is primarily a horrific humanitarian catastrophe. And, there's nothing more kind of moving or terrible, really, than seeing the sort of human plight, the plight of people in Ukraine. But of course, that's one of the bigger drivers now of the rising fuel prices, because even if you don't buy Russian oil and gas directly, those markets are global. The prices are set at the global level. That we don't set them by our demand in the UK. So we can do our bit, but actually only an overall reduction in demand for oil and gas will mean we bring down prices and also stop over-rewarding Putin and his cronies and giving him lots of money to spend on weapons to use in Ukraine. So that's the second bit, really, if you like. We just layered more cost of living increase on top of what was already baked in by the pandemic. And then we've got this crisis in Europe of high temperatures, which has got kind of rippled across the whole continent, really. I mean, it's been over 40 degrees in southern Europe for a couple of weeks now, and it's coming to the UK. And we all like warm, sunny weather, but I don't think any of us really want it to be over 30, let alone over 40, because it's really hard to function and work, and it's a risk to the life of more vulnerable people. So, that's kind of giving us a strong message from the future, if you like, about what severe heat waves, which we're in for a lot more of as a result of climate change, is going to do for us. And then, we can't And then we've got this kind of crisis in government, and a bunch of candidates coming forward who really, for sort of internecine reasons inside the governing party, are trying to sacrifice climate change, to be honest, the policy on climate change, net zero policy, to put themselves forward as leaders. But it seems to me to be a moment for much bigger leadership than that. If that's what we get ultimately as a result of this process of selection of a new prime minister, then that's a real failure of leadership, because the climate crisis is not going to go away, whether we like to wish it away or not. It's going to get worse. But also we'll fall behind as an economy if we don't restructure around at least that. But actually the opportunity is much bigger. So there's this kind of myth of the UK, and I can't do this without mentioning Brexit, I'm afraid, which I know is always a hugely contentious thing. But what seems to me to be an underlying fact, whether you voted for it or not, is that it's made trade with the EU more difficult. They've just made it more expensive because there are more steps in the process, and that's just more costly. So that means that, we've made trade more difficult with our main trading partners, and we're looking to the rest of the world to do more trade as a way of compensating our economy for that. But actually, the problem is that the rest of the world is not in a great state at the moment. And also those supply chains on which trade with the rest of the world are reliant are the things that have been exposed as being hugely fragile in the crisis. So you add all that together, and what it seems to me to mean is opportunity is kind of the wrong word because it sounds opportunistic, but it's a moment at which we need to think really seriously about our place in the global economy as the UK, and what kind of future economy we need, but also we need to show the rest of the world it needs, if you like. And one of the Conservative candidates, I think it was Kemi Badenoch, said, that our net zero policy was a bit like unilateral disarmament. And I think it's completely the opposite. I think it's a bit like showing that we can do this. I think it's a really bad parallel. Whatever you think about the kind of mutually assured destruction and nuclear armaments debate, I think it's actually a really poor parallel, because the thing is, climate change is a global collective action problem. Nature depletion is a global collective action problem. Resource overuse is similarly, and we can all do our bit nationally, but unless everybody moves, we can't do anything. And if we all sit around on our hands waiting for other people to go, not only will we not act enough in time, but also as a UK economy, we will miss our opportunity. And our opportunity in a global market, and we still have to consider our place in the global market, is to be a clean, green, humane economy that provides for its people, but also has a really important place to play in the future, decarbonised, nature-friendly world that we have to create. We don't have a choice. We have to create that. So now is just the time we have to think about it.
And that point about leadership, so there's domestic leadership in a domestic context, which it feels that the current political debate in this country is really focused on. But that leadership also, as you say, has there is a far bigger picture and a bigger goal in sight. And it's also, I think, that point about this being, enough with short-termism. Let's think for the long term about the future we want. So given that we think that this is a pivotal moment, that we think that there is opportunity to not, I understand why you might shake that term, but given that there is an opportunity here to make what we would consider to be the right choices, what would you hope that anyone listening to this or reading the pieces published during the week, what would you hope that they think or do or feel as a result?
Well, the first thing probably to say is that if you're an economist, and Global Action Plan is not an economics think tank. So if you're an economist, tell us what you think. That's the first thing to say, because honestly, this is a complicated debate. But it needs to be had. We've got to use this moment to think about what the future structure of our economy looks like, and how we use it as a moment to make the economy fairer and greener. And I know that sounds a bit trite, but actually that is precisely what we've got to do. And so if we're thinking in any way at the moment about how we reshape demand across our economy. I'm aiming at this particularly at the kind of progressive heterodox economics community. If we're thinking in any way about that, we've got to think green as well as fair. Got to do it. And by green, I don't just mean climate change. I mean genuinely sustainability economics has to be key. The second thing is, I think, frankly, if you're a kind of grant making organisation, you need to be thinking about where this is positioned, because a lot of grant makers have done some really brilliant work in the kind of new economy and new economic space in the past few years, but probably haven't thought about this issue of kind of the structure of future demand. And I think it's a really important one. So that's the second thing to say. And then I guess, the third thing is that and this may seem in this context of the current race to become the new prime minister, it may seem like a vain hope, but we do need leadership on the issue. There's no way we can do this without. So that's the third thing. But Global Action Plan's part in this, as an organisation that's actually really good at normalising things that currently seem extraordinary or alternative, if you like.
Yeah.
Our part is to try and take on that third layer, if you like, those things that we need to do differently as an economy and society, and to help clear the way for policymakers and economists and grant makers to be able to crowd into that space and then do the things that need to be done. Because as we've seen, the battle over climate change is not over. Battle over climate change policy is not over. But, since the pandemic, when councils, for instance, have tried to put low traffic neighbourhoods in, have got pushed back a lot by local populations. One of the readouts from the evaluation of some of that is that they haven't worked hard enough on convincing people that that's the right thing to do. And so, Global Action Plan is an organisation that's very good at that. And so what we pledge, I guess, and will work really hard to do is to try and create that platform, create that space in which all of this seems a lot more normal and not exotic or something that belongs to the future, but something that belongs to now.
Not a fringe concern, but actually something that's incredibly relevant and meaningful for everyone in society. Has a stake in this, and it can and stands to benefit from it as well, really. And starting the debate is the start of that. Having these conversations and putting the ideas out there and seeing how people respond is really the start of it.